Good evening. I'm Jim Turk, and I'd like to welcome you to this conversation being sponsored by the Center for Free Expression at Toronto Metropolitan University. I'd like to begin the session by acknowledging that the territory on which I'm speaking to you tonight is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Tonight's discussion is the second in the Center for Free Expression series, Why Whistleblowers Matter. In broad sense, the work of the center focuses on expressive freedom and the flip side of that, which is the public's right to know. That is, we have a right to express ourselves, but we also have the right to hear. And the reason for that is that for a democratic society to be vibrant, it has to have an informed public, which means transparency at the government level in terms of access to information, but also support for all their avenues by which the public can gather information, which is press freedom, but also protection for whistleblowers who often bring to light vital information for the public that often both the organizations for which they work, the government, and the state more generally may not want particularly known. So we're going to be interviewing tonight or talking with one of the prominent Canadian whistleblowers. His name is Bob Stenhouse. Bob is was one of the RCMP's brightest stars and one of the top undercover specialists in Western Canada. He was troubled by the RCMP's administrative bureaucracy. Hello, Bob.
Hi, Jim.
The silo and turf protection he found, myopic and destructive leadership, ineffective strategies, police propaganda. And he spoke out gently, almost inadvertently. The blowback was vicious. He spoke out more directly and paid a terrible price, typically exacted upon whistleblowers. But Bob's strength brought him through this and into a very important new career. And so Bob's story is interesting, and it's the second in our series. Our first was with Michelle Brill-Edwards, the senior scientist at the Canadian Health Protection Branch. Bob's story, like Michelle's, gives a different perspective, though, on the experience of whistleblowers and the important role that they play in our society. But Bob, let's go back to the very beginning and how you became interested in being a police officer. I understand that it was in part due to early 80s cop shows like Hill Street Blues and Miami Vice.
True enough. I think it even started before that, Jim. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm really pleased to be here as your guest as well. I think it started even before that as a kid. I mean, my favorite books as a younger child was the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew mysteries. And so I grew up on Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew. I then progressed to the spy books I loved. Even in 14 years old, I'm reading spy books by Ken Follett and and some of the spy writers. Yes. And then I read the cop books, Joseph Wambaugh, some of the predominant, authors back in the 1970s. And then I was always fascinated by the police stories, and I watched Columbo and Kojak and all those detective stories.
We'll bring back memories of my youth too.
Exactly. And then I got introduced, of course, to Miami Vice, Hill Street Blues. I'm like, I want to do that. Like, that looks like so cool. I've always been a bit of an adventure guy anyway, and not really sure. I didn't really fit in. I wasn't sure what my career was supposed to be. And it's really funny story, Jim. I had no clue that I would join the RCMP, but I was in between. I had gone and worked as a lumberjack in a logging camp up in Northern Ontario. And I come back from that. I'm like, well, I don't want to do that. That was hard. And there was an ad on. And for some of your listeners from Montreal, they know some of my friends that I grew up with are actually listening. And they'll remember the ad on Chaume FM, join the RCMP. It's a great career. And this ad goes on in the morning. I'm sitting at home at the morning. I'm like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to give this a call. And sure enough, 8 months later, there I was. And so, but I really think it started in my passion for detective work and solving and some of the excitement surrounding that. That's where it started. And then, of course, Miami Vice, and I wanted to be an undercover guy, and all of that happened.
But then one of your first postings, if not your first posting, I think was in Cranbrook, British Columbia. The reality was a little bit different than the cop shows, wasn't it?
It certainly wasn't Miami Vice. However, I did get into the narcotics squad fairly young in my service. And so we basically worked narcotics, buying narcotics in the East Kootenays of British Columbia in the, early to mid 1980s, driving old beater pickup trucks and wearing our camouflage ball cap on tilt. So I wasn't exactly Crockett and Tubbs. But it was still very, very interesting, and it honed my skill set in the area of undercover work as well.
But then you moved on to heavier duty undercover work in Vancouver, did you not, subsequently?
Yeah, correct. I transferred down to Vancouver, where I went into to the Surrey detachment. Then I went into Surrey narcotics. Then I was transferred to Vancouver narcotics, and then I got into formal undercover work as well, all around the mid to late 80s, where our the types of files that we worked on were much bigger and much more, some of them of an international scale.
And then you went on to something even bigger, did you not, in terms of going on to Canada's Anti-Terrorist Commando Unit, CERT?
Yeah, I don't know if it was bigger, but it was certainly different. So I'd done a lot of undercover work, and undercover work is not healthy.
The undercover work you did in Vancouver, was it mainly around drugs or?
Yeah, primarily drugs at the time. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And then when you went to tell people about CERT a bit.
Well, CERT was at the time, it was Canada's national anti-terrorist unit. So everything you see in the movies, jumping out of helicopters down the side of buildings and blowing things up. And so we were the anti-terrorist unit for Canada at the time. And then while I was there, it transferred, I think rightfully so, transferred into the jurisdiction of the military. It's now called JTF2. Oh. And so JTF2 has certainly advanced from those days. I was on the last team of CERT where we trained JTF2, and then we transitioned, and then JTF2 took over those types of duties. So
and you went back to Vancouver undercover work? That's
right. I was recruited back to what was called the Undercover Unit at the time, and at that point in time, the focus of the undercover unit was in the basically the early stages of transitioning from a primarily drug enforcement type of lens for undercover work to homicide. Oh, your listener will likely either you can Google it, you can likely remember or know the term Mr. Big investigations. Okay. And where I was one of the leaders on the team, I was one of the pioneers in the Mr. Big investigation techniques. Just
so what did that entail?
Basically, the Mr. Big technique can be summarized like this, Jim, is that we would portray ourselves as organized crime figures, gangsters. We would infiltrate in whatever fashion that we may. And I'm not telling any secrets, by the way. There's books written about this. It's in the news. It's on Wikipedia. So I'm not telling any secrets or exposing secrets. But we would infiltrate the suspect in a homicide, sometimes in jail, sometimes outside. Gain their confidence through their work with us as this fictitious organized crime gang through a number of roles and plays that we would do with them. And when we finally gain enough confidence, eventually glean eventual confessions to homicide work or to homicides that they had done.
That must have been pretty stressful work, wasn't it?
Highly, highly stressful, highly adventurous, exciting. We were on a constant hypervigilance high. And in hindsight, what I understand about mental health and policing is that hypervigilance, you can't maintain that. And so it's really interesting. You're hypervigilant. I might be in jail with a killer, or I might be infiltrating somebody. We haven't found the body yet. On two of the cases that I worked on, the suspects actually brought myself and my partner to the body. In one case, we actually dug the body up live while they showed us where the body was. And so you have this hypervigilance, and then you come home and you crash hypovigilance. You can't even get off the couch. And that was kind of my pattern during that time of my life. And it was not healthy. I didn't know it at the time, but it wasn't healthy.
Well, then you went on to another post in Edmonton, where I assume it was a similar kind of hypervigilance. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and you work with the motorcycle gangs?
That's right. So I transferred into Edmonton in about 1996, and I was very fortunate to be recruited into the intelligence unit for bikers. And I didn't know a lot about intelligence. And this goes back to some of where my frustration started maybe years earlier. What does intelligence do? I wasn't really sure. I was an investigator. Very different between being an intelligence officer versus an investigator. And I've always been an investigator, gaining the evidence, gaining the convictions, giving the evidence in court, and convicting people for the crime. Intelligence doesn't do that. They gather intelligence. And so I'm on the intelligence unit. I wasn't quite sure what our mandate was. I'm asking questions. Well, why are we taking pictures of the bikers at their biker runs and their biker clubhouse? We're sitting in the back alley in the vans taking pictures of them. I said, what are we going to do with that? And my partner at the time says, well, we'll put it in a report. And I would say, well, so what happens with the report? Well, we send it to Ottawa. Well, then what happens? Well, I don't know. And so I'm like, well, this is the theory of intelligence gathering. It doesn't make much sense to me as being a very operational, investigative type of police officer. And I said, well, why don't we go after them for the crimes that we're saying they commit? Well, we can't go after them. Well, why not? Well, because they're untouchable. So one of my police partners from a municipal police force is telling me that the biker gangs are untouchable. And this was a bit of a theme that I had heard over the years, and I didn't buy it. By that time, I had gained enough confidence in my investigative abilities, and I had been investigating a lot of very serious crime and organized crime type of scenarios. And I thought, well, I'm going to prove that wrong. I don't think they're untouchable. And so I was able to launch into, at the time, the largest organized crime bust in Alberta history as related to biker gangs in Alberta.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It was all in the news. So it was an undercover. We started with an undercover, and then we ended up transitioning to a wiretap investigation, transitioning to a proceeds of crime or a money type of investigation. We had our undercover agent. He was a civilian agent, an undercover agent buying drugs for us from the biker gang. And of course, it was all monitored, and he was wired up and all the things you see in the movies again. And so it was a year-long investigation, extremely challenging, but extremely rewarding.
Yeah. Now, during this, as you were going through this, I mean, you made reference to earlier having become disillusioned a bit. Did that disillusionment grow as you were doing this work, with the frustration of being intelligence and not being expected to go after what you saw was blatant wrongdoing, illegal activity?
Absolutely. And what happened was, at the time I was on the intelligence unit, ironically, the intelligence boss was encouraging us to go after the evidence.
Oh,
But that challenged the drug enforcement boss, who was very critical that we were basically swimming in their lane. And so it goes to this whole idea of silos. So the drug enforcement boss was getting angry, trying to shut us down because we were swimming in their lane.
right.
I was on the intelligence unit with an operationally investigative minded boss, not my partner, but my boss. And he said, this is good. Let's do this.
Mm-hmm.
What made it even really more complex is, in the middle of that, I got promoted to sergeant to the drug enforcement unit. So now I'm basically straddling two very diametrically opposed, siloed parts of policing, departments in policing that didn't share a lot of information with each other. And then we had these police egos and jealousies. And frankly, I mean, I don't mind saying my boss in the drug enforcement was a very, very poor leader.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was trying his very best. I'm in the middle of this massive investigation. I'm the lead. I'm kind of, we had a full team, of course, but I was the lead investigator. And so I'm in the middle of all of this, and I'm getting pressure to shut it down. I'm getting pressure to, okay, that's enough of that biker investigation. Come over here so we can do drug enforcement. I said, well, I am doing drug enforcement, but it's drug trafficking being committed by the bikers. Well, no, I mean other drug enforcement, not the biker stuff. Well, why not? Well, because we're drug enforcement, the biker stuff is intelligence's responsibility. I said, well, but it seems to me that if a organized crime group is engaging in drug trafficking, we should probably try to prove that through our methods that we prove. And it was really bizarre how I really think it was more down to police ego and protection of turf that I was caught smack in the middle of.
So you were feeling these kinds of pressures in addition to the challenges of the hypervigilance and the demands of the job itself.
In addition to still doing Mr. Big investigations as an undercover. So I was still flying across Western Canada involved in Mr. Big investigations while I was conducting this major investigation. And I was also on the emergency response team for Northern Alberta. And so that was the SWAT team, the ERT team for Northern Alberta, getting called out and on, call outs when we had maybe barricaded persons or, high risk situations. So yeah, it was a stressful time.
So how did you, what happened after that? I mean, when you, you had talked with me previously about how you were feeling. I think the words you used were you were feeling angry at times, depressed, frustrated with the siloed politics within the RCMP. You were approached by an author writing a book. Were you not about motorcycle gangs?
I was, but not yet.
What happened?
Still a missing piece. In the middle of all this, our local biker gangs at the time, called the Grim Reapers and the Rebels, were basically, it's a police term, patching over to Hell's Angels.
Okay.
So this is where my frustration started to really grow, because I had seen the Hell's Angels grow from a biker gang, a bunch of people riding bikes involved in a little bit of trouble, to multimillionaire status in British Columbia under our watch. Mm-hmm. I'd seen that happen. I questioned it at the time. Now they're going to become Hell's Angels. And we've really, other than the investigation that we were in the middle of, the approach to it was basically a PR campaign. So 1997, Red Deer, Alberta, I'm there in my role in intelligence. Very, very frustrated, because I'll give you an example. The lead officer, in the midst of this massive, it was in the news, in the midst of this massive, police approach to the Hells Angels, and we were losing, he said, basically, we're losing the media, the PR game. We're looking like the bad guys. So go away, go eat ice cream in Sylvan Lake. Just be around in case something happens. We don't want to see any more presence, because the news was, of course, reporting it seemed to be a little bit of overkill in some of our check stops. And so I was extremely frustrated. I thought, this has been a PR game, and that's what this is about. And that's what you're more worried about. Mm-hmm. And yet we had opportunity to gather a lot of, quote, intelligence, and certainly make it uncomfortable for them to be arriving there. Right. So in the midst of that, Jim, I had gone without 3 days of sleep. I was self-medicating with alcohol, and in my burnout and my hypervigilance, I submitted my resignation.
And how did your commanding officer respond to that?
He chastised me for putting it on the wrong form.
Jeez.
And I'll never forget it. And I wrote it up in a memo. I'm resigning from the RCMP. I stated why. And he called me into his office and scolded me and chastised me. If you're going to quit, you got to put it on form 2575D. And I'm like, if that's not a cry for help with someone that's absolutely burned out, nothing is. And yet that was the type of response. That wasn't a surprise. This particular leader was a very, very poor leader.
So what happened then?
My friends, I had wonderful friends, family talked me out of it. Mm-hmm. And I remember the gathering at my house and talked me out of it. I retracted it. He said, I don't think you can. And, and I said, well, I think I probably can. And no consideration to maybe ask me if I'm okay from a psychological perspective, nothing. So I launched right into the midst of our investigation. It was highly successful, ended up with the convictions of 7 what we call patch wearing outlaw motorcycle gang members, as well as a number of different hangarounds, seizures of pounds and pounds of drugs and cocaine and all kinds of drugs, and seizures of money. It was a highly successful investigation.
And then you were, I think you were then appointed to a committee representing the RCMP. Was it a provincial committee to develop a business plan for fighting organized crime?
Yes, absolutely. So what happened was at the same time this was going on, there were the biker wars in Quebec in the 1990s. And at the one point, some of you, your listeners might remember that there was a young boy that was killed as a result of a bomb being planted by one of the biker gangs. And he was 11 years old. And so that hit the news, of course. And so what happened was the focus on biker gangs was really, really intense in terms of, police leaders and those types of things. And I thought, well, that's great because they are doing all of these crimes that we had said they were doing. So it's really good that they did that the focus on them. However, so then what happened was they decided in Alberta, well, we're going to put a business case to the province to give us more funding to fight the biker gangs and fight organized crime. And they asked me if I would be on this 4-person committee. It was a 3-month project where we had to gather lots of information. And I thought, well, this would be a good opportunity for me to give an operational lens. The other folks on the team weren't all that operationally minded. One was, but to give an operational lens to say, well, this would be an interesting, something new. I hadn't done something like that. So I thought I'd give it a go.
But it didn't turn out quite the way you would have hoped.
No, because what happened, I became privy to a lot of police propaganda. And I became privy
Tell us a little bit about that.
I became privy to the memos that had been previously written to solicitor generals and senior politicians stating, well, look, the feds have 185 people attached to organized crime in Alberta that the feds are paying for. Come on, province, pony up. And I'm sitting there looking at that. I said, we don't have 185 people. We might have 185 federal positions, but we've got like 2 or 4 of us assigned to bikers. And this whole project has started because of the biker issues that have been going on. And so we got 4 of us assigned to quote biker intelligence, all of these other people in their different silos, perhaps drug enforcement, proceeds of crime, all working in their different silos, certainly not working together. So it was very misleading in my view.
So this added to your disillusionment with the world you were in at that time.
Absolutely. And then what happened is that I saw more and more and more. And then I became privy to this, someone that I would look to as say, well, here's a chief of police that means business, a fellow that some of our listeners here might recognize the name of Julian Fantino. And he had been the chief of the London police, and then I think of the Toronto police. I think at the time, it's funny, he bounced from London. I think at the time it was York Regional. And
That's
then,
right.
then he went to Toronto, then he went to the OPP, later on became a minister of parliament and the minister of Veterans Affairs. So at the time, he was the chair of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police.
Right. Okay.
So he was a high profile chief, as you know, living in Toronto. Very, very high profile. He kind of grabbed onto the outlaw motorcycle gang kind of zeitgeist, if you want to call it that, coming out of the wars in Quebec and coming out of the extra attention that was on that, and basically grabbed onto that and said, we're going to do business with the bikers.
Okay.
And I thought, great. Well, finally, we have a police leader that's actually willing to do business with the bikers.
And what happened?
I went to my first conference and all he had to talk about was his media strategy. He didn't talk about investigations. He didn't talk about aligning our resources. He didn't talk about putting specialized teams together to go after the crimes that the bikers were committing. He talked about using the media, making sure that we present how bad they are to the media, and we got to use the media. We got to partner with them.
What's the purpose of using the media in his mind?
At the time, I didn't know.
Okay.
I had my suspicions. I'm pretty naive. This is new to me, right? Police budgets and all those things. I'm like, well, wait a minute here. A little bit of shenanigans going on. And so I didn't know. But what happened was in that process, I became privy to what was called the National Strategy on Outlaw Motorcycle Gangs. So this is while I was in this particular position. And in that strategy, in the minutes of the meeting of the chiefs of police all across Canada, was this sentence: we are going to use the media to scare the public, to put pressure on the government to give us more funding.
Aha.
Written, black and white, minutes of a meeting. Now, I suspect they probably chastised the minute taker at that point in time, said, why did you put that in there? Well, that's what you said, sir. I know, but you're supposed to sugarcoat some of the things we say in these meetings. Black and white, that's exactly what it said. And then how we're going to do that, how we're going to use the media to scare the public, to kind of, and then to put pressure on the government to give police more funding. I had been arguing we do not need more funding. We need to work together. We need to break down the silos. We need to stop the bickering and the fighting between siloed internally, stop the bickering and fighting between police forces across Canada, not sharing information, not working together, not working towards the same goal. We can align. We have enough resources.
Mm-hmm.
You're telling the province of Alberta we have 185, yet there's only 4 of us attached to your number one priority. And so my disillusion just continued. I just thought, you know, I'm now exposed literally to the evidence that shows that this is the type of approach that our police leaders were looking at.
Well, and where we're going in this conversation next is going to relate directly to the whistleblower side of things. Before we do that, I just want to mention to the audience that in this version of Zoom, you can ask questions to Bob. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. So if, as you're listening to our conversation for the next few minutes, we're going to turn to the audience then, please click on the Q&A button and write down any question you might have. And when we come to the part of the event where we turn to the audience, I'll ask Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator for the Center for Free Expression, to share the questions as they come forward. So if you have a question, want more information, or want to explore some other related aspect with Bob, please just write out your question as you think of it, and we'll turn to you in a few minutes. So Bob, you were saying how seeing that all of this talk about the concern about motorcycle gangs, at least in the mind of one of the senior chiefs in the country, was really about how we raise more money for the police, not about how we more effectively deal with the problem.
That's right.
So that must have made you feel really, I mean, that must just added to the disillusion and frustration that you had been feeling before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say I had my micro experiences with my boss trying to stop our investigation, ridicule me for not putting my resignation on the right form, you know, really try to hold me down. And I was, anyone that worked with me knows I was a hard worker and very effective worker. And so I had that at the micro level, and then I'm observing this whole thing at the macro level, at the national level. And it just continued to contribute to my disillusion and anger and frustration.
Now, was it about this time that the author who was working on a book on all this approached you?
Yeah, well, actually, it's interesting because I met him through this particular project I was working on, right? Because we were basically gathering information from stakeholders, and he was known, you know, someone that is supportive of police, someone that is obviously not supportive of the Hells Angels. His name is Yves Levine. I mean, anyone can Google it. And so I've been chatting with Yves anyway about bikers and those types of things. So he he called me one day and he said, "Hey, Bob, I'm just curious. Have you seen the national strategy?" And I said, "Yeah, I have." And he goes, "What do you think?" And by that time, he had gained a little bit of my trust. I had obviously gained some of his trust, and I didn't know this world of journalism and you know, brown envelopes. I didn't understand that world. And I said, "Yeah, I have." And he said, "Well, what do you think?" And I said, "I think it's horrible. I think it's PR and propaganda. It's got nothing to do with investigations. It's got nothing to do with aligning our resources or focusing our strategy in terms of," this is my big frustration, Jim, is the frustration of the bikers. We're telling the world that they're organized crime figures, but we're not proving it.
Right. And
so I'm a prove it guy. And that was what I did in this particular, against all odds. We did it against this particular biker gang. But so I'm like, we need to prove it. Like, and yeah, it was more PR. So I said, "I've seen it." He said, "Do you think you would send it to me?" I thought long and hard. I had some other documents that were kind of supportive of my frustration. No secrets. There was no intelligence secrets. There was no investigative secrets in. It was all about the strategy and the frustrations that we were having. And in my disillusion, in hindsight, in my post-traumatic stress that's since been diagnosed, I did send the brown envelope to the author of Yves Levine, the author.
And then he subsequently actually used it in something he wrote, did he not?
He wrote a book and reprinted them in the book, which I had no clue that's what it was going to be used for. I thought it was just be background. Again, I was naive to this type of stuff. I didn't know.
So when you saw that, you must have been surprised. What did you do?
Well, not only was by that time I had moved on from the biker stuff. I said, I got a haircut, got a real job because my hair used to be down to here. I got promoted to staff sergeant. I'm now in an administrative role. I'm well on my way to becoming a senior officer. And all of a sudden I get emails from some of my former colleagues. Have you seen Levine's book? The strategies are in there. Some of the documents we had that we were frustrated about are in there. And I wonder who did it. And they're pointing fingers at other police officers. They thought, who did it? Everyone's speculating. Everyone's, there's certainly a buzz around it.
Right.
And I'm sitting in my office in my new role. And I took about 10 to 15 minutes to think about it. And I got up, walked into the commanding officer's office, and I self-disclosed. I said, if you're looking at anyone else, it's no one else. I'm the person that did this.
And what was his response or her response?
His response was really, really supportive. He thanked me for it. He said, thank you for coming in. Thank you for letting me know. We're obviously going to have to figure out how to handle this. But I really appreciate it. And so, of course, I had no clue what was going to happen. And I think I booked my first psychologist appointment that afternoon.
So the response from higher up the chain, or at least within the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, was rather different, was it not?
Well, what happened was, and I learned this all hindsight, what happened, the investigations launched. I realized that it was going to be a botched investigation. They put the wrong investigator on it. Mm-hmm. He approached it from his own biased lens, assuming that Levine paid me money, that this was a corrupt act, which it absolutely was not a corrupt act. So he assumed that. So he's pursuing that narrative in his investigation. Some of the people he interviewed are coming back to me and said, wow, he asked some really bizarre questions. Other people he interviewed said, I have no clue about this. Why is he talking to me? And so then he reached out to Mr. Fantino, the person that was criticized in the book,
right,
for his national strategy, and asked Mr. Fantino what he thought about it. Mr. Fantino sends a letter to the commissioner and calls it the most corrupt police act he has seen in his 31 years of policing, and demanded that I get fired. And I got to tell you, Jim, that's the absolute worst thing you can call a highly dedicated, motivated cop is corrupt. Mm-hmm. It struck at my core. Maybe what I did was misguided, maybe a little bit naive, certainly not corrupt. And it struck at my core. But what happened was that caused a chain event, or the chain of events that then ended to my termination from the RCMP. So everything changed as of that memo. And the RCMP, basically, the people involved in the administration tripped over themselves trying to make sure I was fired, breached my rights in the process. I went through 2 weeks of a public hearing that was in the news every day. And it was at that point in time that I think that I really did become a whistleblower. Well,
unlike, I mean, that kind of reaction to disclosing information is a common experience of whistleblowers. Unlike many whistleblowers, though, you didn't just walk away, did you?
No, I was under a gag order. I was ordered to not talk about my story with anybody. And so I sat there and I thought about the reasoning. Well, wait a minute, the senior police, and it was in the news, that police would basically either alleging or inferring I was corrupt.
Yeah.
They're allowed to say that, but I'm not allowed to tell my story to protect my reputation and my dignity, the true story. And so what happened was, and I think Declan Hill is actually listening. Declan, if you're out there, I get a call from Declan Hill, CBC's Fifth Estate at the time. Declan's now a professor down in the US, fighting organized crime in sport. And I get a call from Declan. Declan says, I've been given your name. We're interested in doing a story on what's been going on. And are you willing? And I knew my career was done. By that time, I knew my career was not salvageable. I knew that it was done. And leading up to the tribunal. And so I thought long and hard about whether I would tell my story. And I realized, just like we're talking here today, 25 years later, that if I don't tell my story then, it'll never be told. And I'll forever be known in the eyes of some of these senior leaders as a corrupt cop. And I couldn't live with that. I was still young. And so I agreed to participate in the first CBC's documentary that was done on my particular case. And I remember Declan telling me, he said at the time there was a movie out called The Insider, and Russell Crowe played the lead part. And Declan says, before you agree to this, I want you to watch this movie, and I want you to know it's going to get rough. And it did.
Can you tell us a little bit about it? How it got rough?
Well, what happened was the CBC aired on the first night of my hearing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, first, to tell you why I know all of this, because I ended up doing freedom of information requests, asking for emails from every officer that had their fingers on this. And I got thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. I did 7 freedom of information requests. So I read through every email. And I put the timeline of how the RCMP was responding to what was going on. As soon as they knew the CBC was going to do a show, they were scrambling, and people are speculating, what do we do? What do we do? And there was much wailing and gnashing of teeth in Ottawa. And so they decided that, well, we're going to try to get a court order so that the CBC can't show this documentary. And so it really caused a little bit of angst because my story was being told. And I explained it just the way I'm explaining it to you now. And why I did what I did and how it played out. And of course, that made the senior police leaders look even more bad.
But you did something else as well, did you not, in response to being fired?
You have to refresh my memory on it, Jim. I did lots of things.
I'm referring to going to federal court.
Oh yeah. So I ended up going through my my tribunal. I was painted, the tribunal chair in his wisdom painted me as Bob Stenhouse has lived a defiant life. And I'm like, where did you get that evidence from? I was promoted very, very early in my career. My performance evaluations were all outstanding. Where did you get that I lived a defiant life? And it came from me. You'll appreciate this, Jim, from your labor background. It came from me explaining how I'm wired, and that I'd won my first grievance when I worked in a factory at 16, and I won my second grievance when I worked in the logging camp at 19. And I won them because I had bully bosses that were basically abusing their authority over me, and I didn't sit well with me. Right. And so I explained that in my hearing when I gave evidence, and I presume he must have taken that to me having lived a defiant life. Uh-huh. And so I was terminated. I had a great law firm out of Ottawa, David Yazbek, Jim Cameron, Paul Champ, who is now, quite a famous human rights and lawyer in Ontario as well. They took my case. We took it to the Federal Court of Canada, and we won my case. They identified that the commissioner who received Fantino's letter was biased, did try to influence the outcome of the tribunal hearing, and therefore it had to be set aside. And so I did win my case at the Federal Court of Canada.
And so you were reinstated in the RCMP.
I was, yeah.
But then you knew your career was effectively over. So.
Oh yeah, the same day that I signed my documents, and it's kind of a funny story here, but I had someone take a picture because that's what recruits do when they're signing on to the RCMP. It's one of those posterity pictures. So I took a picture of myself signing back on, reinstated to the RCMP, and then the officer that signed me on then had to suspend me again and put me on administrative leave because they didn't know what to do with me. And so it was at that point in time that I had some pretty good negotiating power in terms of negotiating my retirement.
Well, before we turn to the audience, could you just tell us what's happened to you since?
It's been a journey. I share it now from a place of healing, Jim. Clearly I've come to a place where I'm on a journey. It's still sometimes it hurts, but I share it from a place of healing. It was a dark time, personally, professionally. My marriage ended. My dad passed away all around the same time. I was in a really, really dark place. And so with that journey, I kind of cleaned up my life. I remember distinctly reading something that said, when we have these life things happen to us, we have a choice to get bitter or get better. And I chose better. part of that was a journey of forgiveness, not only forgiveness of myself, but forgiveness of people that have harmed me and, called me corrupt and, tripped over themselves to make sure I was fired and all those things. So from that, I won my case. I ended up going and doing my master's degree in theological studies. From there, I ended up getting hired into in Alberta here, Alberta Health Services for 10 years, leading corporate investigations across the province, and risk management and HR risk management. And so it has been a journey, and I now am the founder and principal director of a successful human resource risk management firm operating in Western Canada, with about 15 associates doing lots of great work out there. So and all of that is foundational to my story, how my own experience. Principles of natural justice and procedural fairness, reasonable apprehensions of bias, all of the factors I won my case at federal court that I now apply in the service to our the clients that we serve. And so we actually investigate whistleblower complaints. We investigate whistleblower stuff. And I'm the voice of reason from my own experience to say, wait a minute, no, don't vilify them. Find out what's happened. Find out the backstory before you jump to vilify the whistleblower.
Right. Well, why don't we turn to the audience? There's a couple more things I want to ask you, but Ange, could you share the first question?
Yeah, and I want to remind attendees that you can use the Q&A button to ask questions at any point in time. Yeah, first question is from Sandy. Sandy says, Bob, thank you for sharing your story. Although your treatment as a whistleblower has many typical elements and some big differences, primarily that you fought back, what advice would you give to others who find themselves in your position?
Yeah, it's I've been asked a lot. I've been asked, people have reached out to me and say, what should I do here? First and foremost is make sure you're on solid ground with what you're blowing the whistle on. I knew I was on solid ground because I had the depth of background and the experience to be able to clearly articulate this is what's happening. So it wasn't something from over here that I thought was happening. It was something that I was experiencing. So I think we need to make sure that we're on solid ground in terms of what we're exposing. Secondly, make good notes, particularly when you do escalate it up, you're trying to exhaust the internal processes to bring about necessary change, and it's getting swatted back down. I regret not having made notes of that. Or not kept emails or not kept memos that I tried to escalate up to say, this is a problem, this is an issue. So I would say, because that's your evidence, right? If it ever comes to something like that. Third, seek some psychological support. It hurts, it's hard. I was extremely loyal and dedicated. It was my identity. My identity was ripped away. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know why I was here. And I had to get some psychological support. And I think that I see that as some of the common themes, as well as people that are, and then lastly, find the right people to help you tell your story. And that means the right law firm. That means people like Jim and the Center for Free Expression. That means people like Declan Hill. That means people that are so passionate about this particular issue that they're going to give you that support. Because I had that. I was introduced to some of the earlier whistleblowers that Jim knows by name as well. And so those are some of the suggestions that I would have. But first and foremost, make sure that the information that you're exposing, that you're on solid ground.
Okay. Ange, do we have another question?
Yeah, we have one more question from Rosemary. Rosemary just is asking, does the province veto the RCMP jurisdiction?
Jurisdiction and policing is very, very different. It's very topical. It's in the news. What I see happen is not necessarily veto. See, the province contracts the RCMP to provide provincial policing. And so in the contract to the RCMP, within that contract, the federal government actually compensates for quite a bit of the pay of the RCMP officers. So I don't necessarily know it, but I got to tell you, I was exposed to the fighting between the province and the feds on these particular issues. And so, like I said, I'm an operational ham and egger kind of cop, launched into the politics of policing, which includes politics and includes budgets. and which caused me to be extremely disillusioned, because the internal fighting is what thwarted us from being able to continue on addressing the organized crime challenges through investigations and conviction.
And there's really no way the public can be aware of what's actually going on amongst the police forces, in this case, except through people like you or others who speak up about what they see happening.
Well, you know, and the interesting thing, Jim, I know Janet Merlo recently won an award. The interesting thing is, back when I was a whistleblower 25 years ago, it was a bad word.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, if you ask people what that term means, it means someone that's disloyal, that's disgruntled, that's trying to tear down the image of the RCMP. Absolutely not. I was one of the most dedicated, hardworking, effective police officers that I worked by, and I worked with many of them like that, because we worked at high level types of investigations. And so, of course, it's that discrediting of the whistleblower that's not uncommon, and it happens. But just Google sexual harassment police Canada. You'll probably get 15 pages of stories coming out. There's one right now in front and center in Ontario with Waterloo. You've got one that's front and center with Toronto. You've got the RCMP. You've got $110 million class action lawsuits being settled because women stood up and blew the whistle and said, this is not okay.
You mentioned Janet Merlo. The Center for Free Expression awards a prize every year. We've named it the Peter Bryce Prize after Peter Bryce, who was a medical officer in the Department of Indian Affairs in the early part of the 20th century.
Right.
And investigated what was happening in residential schools and prepared a report that showed an enormous death rate and sickness rate amongst the residents, and it was suppressed by the federal government. And he finally lost his job and then published it. So was an early whistleblower and paid a significant price. And Janet, who won the award this year, was also an RCMP officer. And as you were mentioning, she blew the whistle on the gender-based harassment and discrimination and sexual assault that women officers face within the RCMP.
Absolutely.
Like you, paid a huge personal price for it.
Yeah.
And yet her work resulted in a multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit. Was that kind of harassment that she spoke about? Was that something that you had seen in your days in the RCMP?
You know, absolutely. I mean, I have one particular case that I talk about in my courses that I provide, my training that I provide, and where 4 RCMP officers came forward with complaints of sexual assault against one of my colleagues. But it flew under my radar because I think I was the type of guy that other men involved in certain, although I did see it, my son's mom was a police officer. I certainly heard the name calling. I was shocked at some of the names that women were referred to in the police, in policing. So I certainly saw and heard that. I wrote it off as just, old dinosaurs, those types of things. I wish I would have stood up. In hindsight, I'm 20 years old with pimples on my face with a badge and a gun, and you got a senior officer referring to women in derogatory terms. You're sitting there saying, this is the RCMP. Okay, well, I'm not going to use those terms, but I'm really surprised that they are, but I'm not going to say anything about it.
Well, and you were talking about whistleblowers and your description of yourself. You were a serious police officer, you were doing your job, you were dedicated. And then suddenly you see these bad things, you become disillusioned, you speak about it. My experience from years of working with whistleblowers is that's almost always the profile of the people who blow the whistle, that they aren't people who are troublemakers or looking to cause trouble. They're actually amongst the most dedicated employees who are really troubled by bad things that see happening. They try to get them fixed internally. They're ignored, they're not fixed, and they don't know what to do. And the ones who become the whistleblowers, the ones who have the internal courage or integrity to be so troubled by it that they have to speak up. And
absolutely.
Then because of the lack of whistleblower protection in Canada, they face a pretty bleak future.
Right. And then you have the outraged senior leaders who don't really understand how important words are, calling you corrupt.
Right.
or calling, stating that you have lived a life of defiance
Right.
because you stood up for your rights. And so discrediting you.
I don't know if you saw the International Bar Association and the Government Accountability Project in the United States, the largest whistleblower protection organization in the world, last year did a study of the effectiveness of whistleblower protection laws in 40 some countries. And Canada came dead last.
Wow.
We were tied with Lebanon and Norway for dead last.
Wow.
So it's a real problem in this country. Ange, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, we do. The next question is from Elsa. Elsa says, thank you for sharing your story with us. Are there any recommendations you think organizations could institute to increase transparency and ease of reporting mechanisms?
Yeah, it's interesting. I worked with Alberta Health Services. We had a whistleblower line, and they're called whistleblower lines now. That's where I said the evolution of the word has come from. When I did it, it was a bad word. Now all of a sudden it's a whistleblower line. And so you've got, safe disclosure lines, whistleblower lines. Larger organizations have that. They're very limited in what they can do. My team had to investigate some of the cases coming through the whistleblower line with Alberta Health Services, and very, very challenging to investigate. I would say in terms of check and balance on transparency, it really is more about at the internal desire of senior leaders to really listen. Get out of your ego, get out of your arrogance, get out of we know best, and start to really, really listen, because someone that is escalating, someone that is a legitimate whistleblower has tried internally, tried to get the attention to say, wait a minute, this is not okay. And they've sent the emails and they sent the letters. And then the next thing you know, they're labeled as troublemakers because they're going to challenge the status quo. So I think that's how organizations can mitigate the risk of a whistleblower from within. Listen, act, be humble. Ask yourselves as you're sitting around that senior leader table, what if he's right? Versus the outrage and the bluff and the bluster. Who does this guy think he is? This all jumped out at me at these emails that I got, Jim, right? These very senior police leaders and their pomp and self-importance and their self-righteous indignation. Who does this guy think he is? And what does he know? And we're letting him run this and blaming each other. And it's just like, I wish I still had them. I ended up getting rid of them, but I wish I still had them to go back now in hindsight, 25 years later, because I teach on this stuff now. Oh. And so to go back 25 years later and say, here's some evidence, isn't this interesting?
Well, and I wish the CBC didn't take down its old Fifth Estate videos. I went back to look at this one from 15 years ago, and it's long since gone and not accessible.
Yeah.
Ange, another question?
The next question, an attendee asks, have you ever considered writing a book on your story to help support other whistleblowers?
It's interesting. I have, and I've tried. I've stopped and started, and I don't have the self-discipline or some of the after effects of my post-traumatic stress just kind of caused me to block. And maybe some stuff is too painful. I don't know. But I've tried. One day, maybe, who knows? But at this point in time, I just don't have that self-discipline to be able to sit down and write. I love to write. I'm a very fast typist. Best course I ever took in high school in the 1970s was typing on the old school, manuals and, moving the arm. And so I'm a very quick typist. I could do it, but maybe one day.
Ange, another question.
The next question is from Sid. Sid says, recognizing that you had a solid awareness of how things worked, do you see the proper supports in place by organizations for those who are possibly traumatized while they go through the process of having to testify about their situations while traumatized? Whistleblowers are not, they are going against the grain, and that in itself is traumatizing.
Absolutely. That's very, very insightful, Sid. No, I don't see anyone, rising to the occasion to ensure that the mental health of people that are going through this particular process, because it's very, very painful, that they're able to come out on the other end with their mental health intact. And I think Jim, you and I talked about that. Depression is prevalent. About someone that's been involved in a whistleblowing situation. Their lives are destroyed. They've lost their confidence, and they're lost sometimes. They're reaching out. They're hurt. They're broken, and no one really pays them any mind, including the organizations that should be there to support them.
You know, and I think part of that feeling of brokenness and despair is precisely because they were really quite committed to the organization they were working for and wanted things to be right and assumed they'd be right and assumed that if they brought wrongdoing or errors or problems to proper authorities' attention, they get fixed.
Absolutely.
It was precisely because they were good employees it was so traumatizing.
Absolutely. And Dr. Jennifer Freyd out of the University of Oregon has coined a term called institutional betrayal. And so on top of the trauma, on top of the pain, on top of having to defend themselves, they feel this strong sense of institutional betrayal. I've been betrayed by my organization.
Right.
And so, you know, added on to all of the other trauma coming out of it.
Okay, Ange, do we have another question?
Yeah, the next question is from Libby. Libby says, I'm from Victoria, Australia, so apologies if our system is different. In Australia, whistleblowers are often silenced because our courts can shut them down by hitting the whistleblower with court costs. Did you run the same risk when you engaged your legal team?
Absolutely. Yeah. When I challenged the findings at the Federal Court of Canada, there was a response from the RCMP or from the federal government, and basically countered the challenge. And of course, most challenges identify that they'll be looking for costs. So I took the risk, you know, again, with a really, really good legal team that was obvious, that specialized in this area, frankly. And I did take that risk, and because I knew that I had the evidence, right? Because I had done the investigation, I had done freedom of information, I had thousands of documents. I had documents that showed the influence of the commissioner. I had documents that showed that they didn't disclose to me what they should have in the course of my hearing. And so with those documents, we brought them to the federal court. So I was quite confident, and of course, confirmed in my confidence by these lawyers that specialize in this area. So it was a risk I took, but it was a well-informed risk. Had they assessed costs against me, then I obviously would probably not be here speaking with you. I would have been one of those statistics of a broken person, no longer a shell of who I was.
Okay, Ange, I think there's one more question.
Yeah, the next question is from Sandy again. Sandy says, sorry, it is both interesting and tragic that we seem to see so many people in policing fall victim to the scenario you have outlined. What can be done specifically to support whistleblowers in the police who are so critical to our society?
I think that the evolution, I shared this on my course that I taught today, the evolution that we're seeing in terms of whistleblowing support, certainly we need the legislation, but organizations like CFE, social media, any organization that is looking to tamper down truth speakers from within are at risk. And so I run a risk management firm. I'm a consultant, and consultants tell our clients what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. And I've told some clients that need to hear, you've got a truth speaker from within, and it's to your detriment if you don't listen to the truth speaker from within, because it will get out. It will be on social media. People are becoming empowered. People are becoming, more courageous in speaking the truth to power. And that's the evolution of our society, I think. So become the organization where it's safe to speak truth to power. Become the leader of the chief of police where it's safe to speak truth to power, and not all of a sudden get all upset and call someone corrupt because they chose to speak truth to power.
Well, Bob, I think that's probably a wonderful place to end our conversation. That's great advice. Organizations, in the absence of legal protection for whistleblowers, actually have a real interest, if they're smart managers, in doing precisely what you said. Now, I'm sorry, just I'm saying this, Ange, I should ask you, are there any more questions before I conclude?
Sorry, just one just came in. So I'll just read it live as it's come in. It's from John. John says there is a minor movement to keep the RCMP in Surrey, although there is a small Surrey police force now in place. One argument is the cost being that if a municipality has RCMP, they received 10% budget support and it be gone if they do not have RCMP. My reply is to ask each MP to make a motion in Ottawa that if any municipality wishes to remove the RCMP, that the 10% allowance is allowed to that municipality if doing so. Do you have a comment on this?
You know, I'm not really privy, and it's funny because it evokes mixed emotions. I still have a lot of pride in the RCMP. Some of my best friends, my lifelong friends, are my former undercover buddies and partners, and we still commit. Some of them are probably listening out there, and so I still have a lot of pride in the RCMP. And yet, I do believe that the evolution of our requirements of policing in Canada, I think the RCMP should stick to federal policing, kind of like the FBI. And I think they should leave local policing and provincial policing to the jurisdiction of impact. That's just my belief on the evolution of policing in the future. But there's a lot of politics involved, and there's a lot of emotion involved with the iconic figure of the RCMP and the Redcoats. That's attached to our national identity. So I can understand both. I still have a lot of pride for the good people that I worked with. I have some forgiveness and hope for the bad people I worked with. But it really is about the people. It's not about the color of the uniform.
Well, Bob, I think we will end at that point. I want to thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I mean, you went through incredible challenges. You've emerged from it in a remarkable fashion. And we're very grateful that you were willing to join us tonight and help the public understand more about whistleblowing and what it actually means and its importance.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, our pleasure to have you. I want to share with the audience that a recording of this conversation is going to be posted on the Center for Free Expression website tomorrow and on our YouTube channel. Our website address is cfe.ryerson.ca. We'll also put, along with the recording of tonight's conversation, some resources for any of you who'd like to look more into either about Bob's case or more generally about whistleblowing. So if you are interested in learning more about these issues, there'll be some suggestions for things you could look at there. The next event that the center will be having will be in several weeks. It'll be on Friday, June 10th. And it'll be another aspect of our looking into the public's right to know. We have a series on threats to press freedom. And up to this point, we've looked at the threats to press freedom internationally in countries that are very repressive of the media. India, Afghanistan, our most recent one was on Russia. We're going to be looking internally. We're going to be looking at the issue of press freedom for student journalists. Because it turns out in Canada, there is really no press freedom for student journalists. So if student journalists report a story that the school administration is unhappy with, it gets shut down. And our panelists for this event are two remarkable high school students in British Columbia who were editors of their school paper and told they couldn't write about what they were writing about. It was something of genuine public interest, both the student body and the parents and the community. And so they fought back on it, and they also brought forward draft legislation for something called a Student Press Freedom Act. And that's being now considered for introduction by the British Columbia government. So that conversation on threats to press freedom, is there press freedom for student journalists? And if so, why? If not, why not? And what can we do about that? Will be on Friday, June 10th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I'd encourage you to tune in to that. You can find more information about any of our events, past ones and upcoming ones on our website, again, cfe.ryerson.ca. Again, thank you to you, Bob, and thank you to others for joining us tonight.
Thanks again, Jim, and thanks everybody out there for spending the time with us today.
Take care.
See you.